Chapter 1. The Festive Invitation. The little grey cells of Hercule Poirot were for once enjoying a rare moment of tranquillity. It was mid-December, and the detective sat in his impeccably ordered London flat, a cup of thick, sweet hot chocolate balanced delicately in his hand. Outside, a light snow fluttered against the windows, softening the harsh lines of the city. Poirot had just returned from a tiresome case in the countryside involving a poisoned vicar and an overly dramatic will reading. He had declared to his valet George that he intended to spend Christmas in perfect repose. No murders, no mysteries, merely the pleasure of good food, good order, and perhaps a small glass of crème de menthe. Yet fate, as it so often does with Hercule Poirot, had other plans. The doorbell rang with a sharp insistence that made Poirot's moustache twitch in mild irritation. George appeared moments later, bearing a silver tray upon which rested a single envelope. It was heavy cream paper, sealed with crimson wax impressed by a coat of arms, a black tower flanked by 2 ravens. "Delivered by hand, sir," George informed him. "The messenger waited only long enough to ensure it reached you." Poirot raised an elegant eyebrow. He slit the envelope with a silver letter opener and drew out a card edged in gold. "Lord Edmund Harrington requests the pleasure of the company of Monsieur Hercule Poirot at Blackwood Manor, Yorkshire for Christmas, from the 23rd to the 27th of December." Beneath the formal invitation was a handwritten note in a bold, impatient script. "My dear Monsieur Poirot, I have heard that you possess the finest detective brain in Europe. My family and I would be honoured if you would join our traditional Christmas gathering. The Yorkshire moors are beautiful under snow, the house is warm, and the company, well, let us say it is lively. I confess there are certain old stories attached to Blackwood Manor that might amuse a man of your profession. Nothing serious, of course, merely shadows of the past. I do hope you will accept. Yours sincerely, Edmund Harrington Poirot," placed the card upon the table and regarded it with the expression of a cat who has spotted an intriguing new mouse. "Shadows of the past," he murmured. "How very vague! And how very English!" He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Lord Harrington was not unknown to him by reputation. A self-made industrialist who had risen from modest origins to considerable wealth during the war years, manufacturing munitions and aircraft parts. He had purchased Blackwood Manor, a sprawling Elizabethan pile on the edge of the North York moors, only 5 years earlier. Society gossip claimed the house carried an unfortunate history. A murder on Christmas Eve in 1897, the details of which had never been satisfactorily explained. The victim, a young heir, had been found stabbed in the library, the windows locked, the doors bolted from within, and, most curiously, a long, distorted shadow cast upon the wall as though someone had stood behind a bright lamp. No culprit was ever brought to justice, and the family had abandoned the house shortly afterwards. Poirot sipped his chocolate thoughtfully. He had no particular desire to leave London at Christmas, yet something in the tone of Lord Harrington's note intrigued him. The man protested too much that the old stories were nothing serious. And the phrase "shadows of the past" had been underlined, ever so lightly, as though the writer wished to draw attention to it without appearing to do so. That evening, Poirot dined alone, his mind turning over the invitation like a puzzle box. By the time George served the tisane, the decision was made. "You will pack for cold weather, George," Poirot announced. "We depart for Yorkshire on the 23rd. Hercule Poirot will spend Christmas among the English aristocracy." George allowed himself the faintest of smiles. "Very good, sir. Shall I include the thick woolen waistcoats?" "All of them," Poirot replied firmly. "The Moors are treacherous." On the morning of the 23rd, Poirot boarded the train at King's Cross with a small, perfectly fitted suitcase and his favourite fur-lined overcoat. The journey north was smooth, the carriage warm, and Poirot occupied himself by observing his fellow passengers, a harassed mother with 3 boisterous children, an elderly clergyman absorbed in a book of sermons, and a young woman in a green velvet hat who kept glancing nervously at the window, as though expecting to see someone following the train. As the landscape changed from suburban sprawl to rolling fields dusted with snow, Poirot's thoughts returned to Blackwood Manor. He had, on a whim the previous evening, telephoned an old acquaintance at Scotland Yard and inquired discreetly about Lord Harrington. The reply had been interesting. Harrington was respected, wealthy, and known for a certain ruthlessness in business. But there were whispers, nothing concrete, about irregularities in wartime contracts. More intriguingly, the inspector had added, "Funny thing, Poirot. Harrington's been asking questions himself lately about locked-room murders from the last century. Seemed quite keen on that old Blackwood case." Poirot's green eyes gleamed. So, the invitation was not entirely social. The train reached York in the late afternoon. A chauffeured Bentley waited at the station, its driver holding a placard bearing Poirot's name. The drive to Blackwood Manor took another hour, along narrow lanes flanked by stone walls and skeletal hedgerows. Snow had begun to fall again, thick silent flakes that blurred the edges of the world. At last, the car turned between tall gateposts topped with stone ravens, the same emblem as on the wax seal, and proceeded up a winding drive. Blackwood Manor emerged from the whiteness like something from a Gothic tale. Dark stone walls, mullioned windows glowing with lamplight, tall chimneys sending plumes of smoke into the darkening sky. A massive wreath of holly and ivy adorned the oak front door, and fairy lights twinkled along the eaves, lending the house a festive air that somehow only accentuated its brooding atmosphere. The door opened before the car had fully stopped, and Lord Edmund Harrington himself strode out to greet his guest. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, with iron-grey hair and a military bearing. His face was handsome but hard, the eyes sharp beneath heavy brows. "Monsieur Poirot!" he boomed, extending a large hand. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor. I cannot tell you what an honour this is." Poirot descended from the car with his usual precision, adjusting his Homburg hat against the snow. "The honour is mine, Lord Harrington. Your invitation was most intriguing." Harrington laughed, a sound that seemed a little too loud. Come in, you must be frozen. We have a fire roaring and mulled wine waiting." As they crossed the threshold into a vast entrance hall panelled in dark oak, Poirot's gaze swept the surroundings with professional interest. A towering Christmas tree stood at the foot of a grand staircase, decorated with glass baubles and real candles yet to be lit. Garlands of evergreens draped the banisters, and the air was rich with the scent of pine, cinnamon, and wood smoke. Servants bustled quietly, carrying trays and logs. Somewhere deeper in the house, a piano played a gentle rendering of "God Rest You Merry Gentlemen." Yet beneath the festive warmth, Poirot detected something else, an almost imperceptible tension, like a string drawn too tight. The footman who took his coat avoided his eyes. A maid hurrying past glanced nervously toward the upper landing. Lord Harrington led him toward the drawing-room. "My family and other guests are gathered here. We are a small party this year, only 12, including yourself. I hope you will not find us too dull." "Dull?" Poirot smiled politely. "With Hercule Poirot present, mon ami, dullness is impossible." As they entered the long, elegantly proportioned drawing-room, conversation paused for a moment. A dozen faces turned toward the newcomer. Poirot noted them all in an instant. The sharp-eyed dowager in black lace, who must be Lady Harrington. The handsome young man with restless hands, perhaps the son. The beautiful woman in emerald silk, whose smile did not reach her eyes. The portly businessman nursing a whiskey. The pale young woman clutching a book as though it were a shield, and others besides. Lord Harrington performed the introductions with practised ease, but Poirot's attention was caught by one guest in particular. A thin, ascetic man with piercing dark eyes and a neatly trimmed beard, dressed entirely in black. "And this," said Harrington, "is Dr. Felix Lang, an old friend of the family. He has a particular interest in local history." Dr. Lang inclined his head. "I have read of your exploits with great admiration, Monsieur Poirot. It is a pleasure." The man's voice was soft, almost hypnotic. Poirot felt the little grey cells stir. "The pleasure is mutual, Doctor." A gong sounded in the distance. Dinner. As the party moved toward the dining room, Poirot lingered a moment by the great fireplace. On the mantelpiece stood an old photograph in a silver frame. A group of people in Victorian dress gathered beneath the same Christmas tree that now dominated the hall. At the edge of the group, almost obscured by shadow, stood a figure whose face had been scratched out with what appeared to be deliberate violence. Poirot's gaze lingered on the defaced image. Outside, the snow continued to fall, thick and silent, erasing the world beyond the manor walls. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck 6. Hercule Poirot smoothed his moustache with satisfaction. It was going to be, he reflected, a most interesting Christmas. Chapter 2. Arrival in the Blizzard. The snow began in earnest as the Bentley left the main road and climbed onto the high moors. What had been a gentle flurry in York was now a swirling white curtain that reduced visibility to a few yards. The chauffeur drove slowly, headlights cutting pale tunnels through the storm, while the wind howled around the car like a living thing. Hercule Poirot sat in the back seat, gloved hands folded neatly in his lap, watching the world disappear. "Formidable, this English weather," he murmured to himself. "It isolates one most efficiently." The driver, a taciturn Yorkshireman named Briggs, grunted in agreement but offered no further conversation. Poirot did not mind. He was occupied with reviewing the passenger list Lord Harrington had mentioned. 12 in total, including himself, a classic number for a house party, he reflected wryly. One could almost imagine Agatha Christie herself choosing it for dramatic effect. After nearly an hour of crawling progress, the car slowed and turned between the raven-topped gateposts Poirot had glimpsed in fading daylight the previous day. The drive seemed longer now, the trees along it bent under heavy loads of snow. At last the manor loomed ahead, its windows glowing like watchful eyes. Even in the storm, the great wreath on the front door was visible, now dusted white. Briggs brought the car to a careful halt beneath the porte-cochere. Almost immediately, the massive oak door opened, spilling warm light and the sound of voices onto the snow. Lord Harrington appeared again, this time in a thick tweed jacket, accompanied by a footman carrying an enormous umbrella. Monsieur Poirot! You've made it through the worst of it, by God! Come in quickly. Don't want you catching your death before dinner." Poirot descended with his customary care, clutching his small valise. The wind snatched at his coat and threatened to dislodge his hat, but he held it firmly in place. "My lord, you are too kind. The journey was memorable." Harrington laughed heartily and ushered him inside. The entrance hall felt even warmer after the biting cold outside. The great Christmas tree sparkled with newly lit candles, their flames reflecting in hundreds of glass ornaments. Servants hurried to take Poirot's coat and hat, and the scent of mulled wine and roasting chestnuts filled the air. But something had changed since his arrival the previous evening. The atmosphere was subtly altered, conversations hushed as he entered, eyes flicking toward him with curiosity or apprehension. Poirot noticed it at once. His reputation had preceded him, and in a house already harbouring secrets, that was never entirely welcome. Lord Harrington led him toward the drawing-room. "We've had 2 more arrivals since yesterday, delayed by the weather like yourself. You'll meet them shortly. First, let me introduce you properly to the household." They paused at the foot of the grand staircase, where a woman was descending. She was in her late 50s, tall and imperious, dressed in deep burgundy velvet with a diamond brooch at her throat. Her iron-grey hair was perfectly coiffed, and her eyes, sharp and pale blue, fixed on Poirot with cool assessment. "My wife, Lady Harrington," Lord Harrington said. "My dear, this is the famous Monsieur Hercule Poirot." Lady Harrington extended a gloved hand. "Monsieur, we are honoured. Edmund has spoken of little else since you accepted." Her voice was refined, with the crisp vowels of old county families, though Poirot knew from his research that she had been born plain Miss Amelia Carver, daughter of a Manchester mill owner. The marriage had united new money with older lineage. "Enchanté, madame," Poirot bowed over her hand. "Your home is magnificent. One feels the history in every stone." Her smile was thin. "Yes, the history. Some would say too much history." Before Poirot could pursue this interesting remark, a young man bounded down the stairs 2 at a time. He was in his mid-20s, handsome in a careless way, with untidy fair hair and restless energy. "Father, is this the detective?" He stopped abruptly, extending a hand. "Richard Harrington, call me Dickie. Everyone does. Jolly good of you to come, sir. We've all been dying to meet you." His grip was firm, almost too enthusiastic. Poirot noted the slight flush in his cheeks. Whiskey, perhaps, or excitement. "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Harrington. I trust you are enjoying the festivities." "Oh, rather. Though this storm's put a bit of a damper on things. Can't even get out for a decent ride." He glanced toward the windows where snow continued to pile against the glass. "Still, keeps everyone nicely bottled up together, what?" Lord Harrington cleared his throat. "Dickie, why don't you show Monsieur Poirot to the drawing-room? The others are gathering for drinks." As they walked down the corridor, Richard talked rapidly about hunting, cars, and the excellence of his father's cellar. Poirot listened politely, observing. The young man's eyes darted frequently to closed doors, and his conversation had an edge of forced gaiety. The drawing-room was crowded and warm. A huge log fire blazed in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the panelled walls. The guests from the previous evening were there, along with new faces. Poirot's gaze was immediately drawn to a woman standing apart by one of the tall windows. She was perhaps 30, with striking dark red hair and pale skin, wearing a gown of deep green silk that caught the firelight. She held a glass of champagne, but had not drunk from it. When she turned, Poirot saw that her eyes were a remarkable violet shade, and her expression was one of quiet watchfulness. "Ah, there's Evelyn," Richard said, following his gaze. "My cousin, well, second cousin actually, Miss Evelyn Trevorrow. Bit of a blue stocking, but dashed pretty, don't you think?" Before Poirot could respond, Lord Harrington's voice boomed across the room. "Everyone, may I present Monsieur Hercule Poirot properly?" Conversation stilled. Poirot found himself the centre of attention as introductions were made. There was Colonel Archibald Blaine, retired Indian Army, florid-faced and moustached, who shook Poirot's hand with military vigour and immediately began recounting his experiences with crime in the Punjab. His wife, Mrs. Blaine, plump and twittery, expressed delight that a real detective was present in case anything exciting happens. Mr. Silas Pemberton, Lord Harrington's business partner, was a stout man with shrewd little eyes behind gold-rimmed spectacles. He regarded Poirot with cautious interest, as though calculating his potential usefulness. Miss Clarissa Wade, a pale young woman of about 22, was introduced as Lady Harrington's goddaughter. She clutched a book of poetry and barely spoke above a whisper, but her eyes followed every movement in the room. Dr. Felix Lang, the thin, dark man from the previous evening, merely inclined his head in greeting. He was seated in a corner, observing the gathering with the detached air of a scientist studying specimens. And finally, the two new arrivals. Mrs. Lavinia Forsyth, a handsome widow in her 40s, draped in black lace and pearls, who claimed to be an old friend of Lady Harrington's, and her companion, Mr. Victor Drake, a smooth-faced man of indeterminate age, with slick dark hair and an unctuous manner. As drinks were pressed upon him, Poirot accepted a small glass of sirop de cassis. The conversation turned inevitably to the weather. "They're saying this is the worst storm in 20 years, Colonel Blaine announced. "Telephone lines are down. Roads completely blocked. We're properly cut off." A small silence followed this statement. Poirot noticed several quick glances exchanged. "Capital!" Richard exclaimed with forced cheer. "A real old-fashioned Christmas, snowed in with nowhere to go." His mother shot him a sharp look. "Let us hope the supplies hold out." From her position by the window, Evelyn Trevorrow spoke for the first time. Her voice was low and clear. The last time Blackwood Manor was completely cut off by snow was Christmas 1897. Every head turned toward her. Dr. Lang's eyes narrowed with interest. "Was it, indeed?" Poirot asked softly. Evelyn met his gaze steadily. "Yes, the year of the murder." Lady Harrington set down her glass with a sharp click. "Really, Evelyn, must we discuss such morbid things at Christmas?" But Evelyn continued, as though she had not heard. "The young heir, Reginald Blackwood, was found stabbed in the library on Christmas morning. The house was snowbound. No one could have entered or left, yet the killer was never identified." Richard gave an uncomfortable laugh. "Old ghost story. Probably committed suicide, and the family covered it up to avoid scandal." "Suicide does not usually cast such very long shadows," Dr. Lang murmured. All eyes turned to him. He was staring into the fire, where the flames threw distorted shapes across the walls. "What do you mean, Doctor?" Mrs. Blaine asked breathlessly. Lang smiled faintly. "Merely that the police photographs, yes, I have studied them, show a most peculiar shadow on the library wall behind the body, as though someone very tall stood between the victim and the lamp. Yet when the room was examined, there was no one there. and no footprints in the snow outside the French windows. A log cracked loudly in the grate. Someone, Clarissa Wade, Poirot thought, gave a small gasp. Lord Harrington cleared his throat. Ancient history, and wildly exaggerated, I'm sure. Now shall we go into dinner? The gong sounded 5 minutes ago. As the party moved toward the dining room, Poirot lingered a moment. He approached the fireplace where Dr. Lang still sat. "You are interested in this old case, Doctor?" Lang looked up, his dark eyes unreadable. "Fascinated, Monsieur Poirot. It represents a classic impossible crime. One might almost say a challenge." Poirot smoothed his moustache thoughtfully. One might indeed. Outside, the wind howled louder, driving snow against the windows with increasing violence. Inside, the candles on the Christmas tree flickered as though something unseen had passed close by. And in the long corridor leading to the dining room, where suits of armour stood in their ancient vigil, Hercule Poirot caught, just for an instant, the fleeting impression of movement in the shadows. When he turned sharply, there was nothing there, only the echo of his own footsteps and the soft, almost imperceptible rustle of something retreating into darkness. Dinner awaited, and with it, perhaps the beginning of something far more dangerous than a simple Christmas house party. Chapter 3. The Midnight Carol. Christmas Eve had fallen over Blackwood Manor like a heavy velvet curtain. Outside, the blizzard raged unchecked, piling snow against doors and windows until the house seemed buried alive. Inside, every effort had been made to defy the storm with light and warmth. Candles glowed in every sconce, fires roared in every grate, and the great hall had been transformed for the traditional evening of carols and feasting. By 9 o'clock the party had assembled in the hall. The towering Christmas tree now blazed with dozens of real flames, their reflections dancing in the polished floorboards. Long tables groaned under platters of roast goose, glazed ham, mince pies, and a towering Yule log cake. Servants moved silently with decanters of mulled wine and hot punch spiced with cloves and cinnamon. Hercule Poirot stood a little apart, near one of the tall windows, watching the scene with quiet satisfaction. Order and symmetry pleased him, and here was symmetry indeed. 12 guests arranged around the tree like the figures on a clock face. Lord Harrington presided at the head, Lady Harrington at his side. Richard lounged with affected carelessness, whisky glass in hand. Colonel Blaine told loud stories to Mrs. Blaine and Mrs. Forsyth. Dr. Lang sat motionless in a high-backed chair, eyes half closed as though listening to music only he could hear. Evelyn Trevorrow stood near the piano, turning pages for Clarissa Wade, who played with surprising skill. Poirot sipped his tisane, refusing the mulled wine as too heavy for his digestion, and allowed his gaze to travel slowly over each face. Motives, opportunities, alibis. Already the little grey cells were arranging the pieces. The old murder of 1897 hovered in the air like incense, mentioned by no one, yet impossible to ignore. At 10 o'clock the carols began. Clarissa played Once in Royal David City, and the company sang with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Richard's baritone was strong but slightly off-key. Evelyn's contralto was pure and steady. Even Poirot permitted himself to join in "Hark, the herald angels sing," his precise tenor blending neatly with the others. After the third carol, Lord Harrington clapped his hands. "Time for the wassail bowl," he announced. A huge silver punch bowl was carried in by 2 footmen, steaming and fragrant. Everyone gathered round as Harrington ladled the hot liquid into cups. "To absent friends," he toasted, raising his cup. "And to those present," Colonel Blaine added heartily. Glasses were lifted, drunk from, refilled. The mood grew warmer, laughter louder. Richard began an impromptu rendition of The 12 Days of Christmas, assigning each guest a verse. When he reached 5 gold rings, he pointed dramatically at Mrs. Forsyth's heavily bejewelled hand, provoking delighted laughter. Poirot smiled politely but did not drink deeply. He noticed that Dr. Lang took only a token sip, and that Evelyn Trevorrow set her cup down untouched after the toast. At 11:30, the party moved toward the dining room for a late supper. As they passed through the long gallery, its walls lined with ancestral portraits, Poirot fell into step beside Evelyn. "You sing beautifully, mademoiselle," he said quietly. "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot." Her violet eyes met his briefly. "Though I fear the old songs carry unhappy memories in this house." "Memories of 1897? She nodded. "My great-grandmother was a Blackwood before her marriage. She was here that Christmas. She always maintained that the shadow seen on the library wall was real, that someone escaped justice." "And you, mademoiselle, do you believe in ghosts?" "I believe in secrets," she replied softly, "and in people who will do anything to keep them buried." Before Poirot could question her further, they reached the dining room. The table was laid with crystal and silver, the centerpiece a magnificent arrangement of holly, ivy, and mistletoe. Places were taken, soup served, conversation flowed. It was just after midnight, Christmas Day now officially begun, when the first disturbance occurred. Richard Harrington rose unsteadily from his chair, glass in hand. "A toast," he declared, "to the family fortune, and may it stay where it belongs." Several faces tightened. Lady Harrington's lips thinned. Silas Pemberton, the business partner, cleared his throat uncomfortably. Lord Harrington forced a laugh. "Sit down, Dickie. You've had enough." But Richard was not to be silenced. "Oh, come now, father. We all know why we're gathered so cosily. The will, the shares, the—" "Richard!" Lady Harrington's voice cut like a whip. He subsided, muttering into his chair. An awkward silence fell, broken only by the wind howling outside. Then Clarissa Wade, perhaps trying to help, began softly to play Silent Night on the small piano in the corner. One by one, voices joined in, the moment passed. At 1 o'clock, the party began to break up. Guests drifted toward the staircase, wishing each other a Merry Christmas. Poirot lingered in the hall, watching the candles on the tree burn lower. He was about to retire when he noticed Dr. Lang standing alone near the library door, staring intently at something on the floor. Poirot approached quietly. "You have found something of interest, Doctor?" Lang started slightly, then smiled his thin smile. "Merely observing the shadows, Monsieur Poirot. See how the candlelight throws them across the floor?" Poirot looked. The tree candles indeed cast long, wavering shadows that stretched toward the library like dark fingers. "Interesting," Poirot murmured. "In the old case, the shadow was cast upon the wall behind the victim." "Precisely," Lang said softly. "And note, no one standing between the light and the wall could produce such a shape. It is suggestive." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Lang bowed slightly and withdrew upstairs. Poirot remained alone in the hall. The house had grown quiet, only the wind and the occasional creak of old timber. He walked slowly around the tree, examining the ornaments. Among the glass balls and tinsel, he noticed something odd. A small white envelope tucked between 2 branches, almost hidden. He removed it carefully. The paper was heavy, the flap sealed with plain wax. Written on the front in neat capitals was a single line: "For the guests of Blackwood Manor." Inside was a folded sheet. Poirot unfolded it beneath the candlelight and read, "The shadow returns this Christmas. One among you carries the old guilt. Justice delayed is justice denied. Beware the midnight hour." There was no signature. Poirot's eyebrows rose. He folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket. A warning? A threat? Or merely someone's idea of a festive jest? He looked around the empty hall. The candles were guttering now, shadows leaping wildly. For a moment he thought he saw movement, something dark and tall detaching itself from the wall near the library. He turned sharply, but there was nothing, only the wind rattling the great front door as though something outside sought entry. Poirot smoothed his moustache thoughtfully. "So," he said to the silent house, "the game begins." He turned toward the staircase, but paused at the foot. From the upper landing came the faint sound of a door closing softly, then footsteps retreating along the corridor. Someone else, it seemed, had not yet retired. Poirot climbed the stairs slowly, his mind racing. 12 guests, 12 suspects, perhaps. The old murder and the new threat intertwined like ivy around the manor's ancient stones. At the top, he paused again. A faint scent lingered in the air, something sharp and medicinal, gone almost before he identified it. His room lay at the end of the east wing. As he passed the library door, on the ground floor directly beneath, he noticed that it stood slightly ajar. A thin line of light showed within. Curious, Poirot descended the few steps to the hallway and approached the door. He pushed it open gently. The library was in darkness, except for a single lamp burning on a side table. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, leather-bound volumes gleaming dully. A fire had burned low in the grate, and on the large partner's desk in the center of the room lay a single object that caught the lamplight. A long, sharp paper knife with an ivory handle. Poirot crossed to examine it. The blade was clean, but something about its position, placed precisely parallel to the desk edge, struck him as deliberate. He looked up at the wall behind the desk. The lamp threw his own shadow there, distorted by the angle into something tall and menacing. For a long moment he stood motionless, considering. Then, with his usual precision, he turned off the lamp, closed the door softly behind him, and returned upstairs. In his room he placed the anonymous note in his small leather writing case beside his bed. He undressed methodically, donned his silk pajamas and dressing gown, and sat for some time at the window watching the snow. The clock in the village church, though no one could reach it now, would have struck 2. Somewhere in the great house below, Hercule Poirot knew someone was awake and waiting for midnight on Christmas Day, waiting for the shadow to fall again. He turned off his bedside lamp and lay in the darkness, eyes open, the little grey cells working with their customary precision. It would be, he reflected, a Christmas to remember. Chapter 4. The Silent Scream. Christmas morning dawned white and silent. The storm had spent its fury during the night, leaving behind a world transformed. The moors buried under deep drifts, every tree and wall outlined in thick frost. No track or road remained visible. Blackwood Manor was an island in a frozen sea. Hercule Poirot awoke early, as was his habit. He performed his toilette with meticulous care, twirled his moustaches to perfect points, and descended to the breakfast room at precisely 8 o'clock. Only the servants were stirring. A footman informed him that Lord Harrington had ordered breakfast, served informally from 8 until 10, as many guests had retired late. Poirot helped himself to a single boiled egg, thin toast and black coffee. He ate at a small table by the window, watching snow slide occasionally from overloaded branches outside. The anonymous note from the previous night lay folded in his inner pocket. He had examined it again by lamplight. Good quality paper, typed on a modern machine, no fingerprints likely. The wax seal had been pressed with a plain coin. Amateur, yet careful. At 8:30, Richard Harrington appeared, looking pale and heavy-eyed, smelling faintly of brandy. He nodded to Poirot and piled his plate high with devilled kidneys and bacon. "Morning, monsieur. Sleep well. Admirably, merci. And you?" Richard grimaced. "Bit of a head. Too much wash sail." He sat opposite Poirot and attacked his food with determination. After a moment he added, "Father's worried about the telephone lines. Still dead. Briggs says we're properly cut off. No chance of getting out for days." Poirot inclined his head. "A situation not without precedent in this house, I believe." Richard shot him a quick glance, but said nothing. By 9 o'clock, others began to drift in. Colonel Blaine in tweeds, complaining loudly about the cold. Mrs. Blaine in a woolen dressing gown. Clarissa Wade, pale and silent, taking only tea. Dr. Fajibach Lang appeared last, immaculate in black, and greeted Poirot with a courteous bow before seating himself apart with a single slice of dry toast. No one mentioned the note Poirot had found, yet he sensed its presence like an uninvited guest at the table. After breakfast, Poirot returned to the great hall. The Christmas tree candles had been extinguished, but the decorations still glittered in the pale morning light, filtering through high windows. Servants were clearing away the remains of last night's feast. Poirot walked slowly around the tree, examining the spot where the envelope had been hidden. Nothing remained, no thread, no mark. He was about to move away when a folded scrap of paper caught his eye, half concealed beneath the velvet tree skirt. He retrieved it carefully. It was a torn corner of heavier stock, bearing part of a typed sentence. "The old guilt. Justice delayed." Clearly a fragment of the original note, torn off accidentally perhaps, and kicked aside during the cleaning. Poirot pocketed it with satisfaction. A small clue, but clues were his currency. At 10 o'clock Lord Harrington summoned the household to the drawing-room for the traditional exchange of gifts. Parcels were piled beneath the tree, and for a brief hour the atmosphere lightened. Richard received a new hunting rifle from his father, Lady Harrington a sapphire brooch, Evelyn Trevorrow a leather-bound set of Shelley's poems. Poirot himself was presented with an exquisite silver cigarette case engraved with his initials, an unexpected courtesy from his host. Yet, even amid the polite exclamations and thanks, tension simmered. Poirot noticed that Silas Pemberton, the business partner, received no gift at all, and his smile grew fixed when Richard unwrapped a gold pocket watch that must have cost a small fortune. Shortly before noon, the party dispersed, some to write letters that could not be posted, others to read by the fires. Poirot decided to explore the library. The door was unlocked. He entered quietly. The room was as he remembered. Dark panelling, thousands of books, the faint scent of old leather and beeswax. Sunlight filtered through high windows, throwing bars of light across the turkey carpet. The partner's desk stood in the centre, the ivory-handled paper knife still positioned with mathematical precision. Poirot approached it. The blade was perhaps 8 inches long, narrow, and wickedly sharp, more dagger than letter-opener. He did not touch it, merely observed. On the blotter beside it lay a small stack of correspondence, and atop that a single sheet of manor notepaper on which someone had written in pencil, "Library, midnight, come alone." The handwriting was hurried, almost illegible. Poirot's eyes narrowed. A rendezvous or a trap? He was photographing the scene in his mind when he heard a soft gasp behind him. He turned swiftly. Clarissa Wade stood in the doorway, one hand pressed to her mouth, eyes wide with shock. "Monsieur Poirot! I didn't know anyone was here." She was very pale, clutching a book to her chest as though for protection. Poirot smiled reassuringly. "You wish to read, mademoiselle? The library is at your disposal." She hesitated, then stepped inside, closing the door softly. I often come here. It's quiet." Her gaze flickered to the desk, then away. "Did you find something?" Poirot regarded her thoughtfully. "One finds many things in libraries, n'est-ce pas? Knowledge, secrets, sometimes danger." Clarissa shivered. "This house is full of secrets. I've felt it since I arrived. Tell me, mademoiselle," Poirot said gently, "what do you know of the events of 1897? She glanced toward the windows as though fearing eavesdroppers. "Only what Evelyn told me. But last night, after the carols, I thought I heard someone crying in here. A woman, soft, terrible sobs. When I opened the door, there was no one." Poirot's interest sharpened. "At what time?" "About 1 o'clock, perhaps. I couldn't sleep." "And this morning?" She shook her head. "Nothing, only—" She pointed to the wall behind the desk. "Look at the shadow." Poirot turned. The winter sunlight, low and slanting, threw the shadow of the paper knife across the panelling. A long, thin silhouette, ending in a sharp point. "Like a dagger," Clarissa whispered. "Indeed," Poirot murmured. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Clarissa curtsied nervously and fled. Poirot remained, examining the wall more closely. The panelling was old oak, dark with age, but in one place a rectangular patch was slightly lighter, as though a picture or mirror had recently hung there and been removed. He was tracing the outline with a fingertip when the scream came. It was high, piercing, cut off, almost immediately, as though a hand had been clamped over the screamer's mouth. It came from somewhere above, directly overhead, perhaps the floor above the library. Poirot moved with surprising speed for so compact a man. He flung open the library door and raced up the main staircase 2 steps at a time. In the upper corridor, guests were already appearing from their rooms. Lady Harrington in a silk robe, Richard half-dressed, Colonel Blaine bellowing questions. The scream had come from the west wing. Poirot led the rush along the corridor, past suits of armour and faded tapestries. The door to Silas Pemberton's bedroom stood open. Inside, Mrs. Blaine stood frozen, one hand still raised to her mouth. On the floor lay Silas Pemberton, face down, a dark stain spreading across the back of his dressing gown. Poirot knelt swiftly. The man was dead, stabbed once, with great force, between the shoulder blades. The wound was narrow, deep, precise. Death had been almost instantaneous. Richard pushed forward, face ashen. "Good God! Pemberton!" Lord Harrington arrived, breathing heavily. "What in heaven's name—" Poirot raised a hand for silence. He examined the body without moving it. The dressing gown was heavy brocade. The weapon had passed clean through and into the flesh beneath. No sign of it remained. It had been withdrawn. The room showed no sign of struggle. A breakfast tray stood untouched on a side table. Coffee cold, toast congealing. The bed had been slept in. Pemberton must have risen, partially dressed, admitted his killer, or been surprised by him. Poirot looked at the windows, closed and bolted against the cold. No footprints in the snow on the sill outside, 3 stories up in any case. He turned his attention to the wall opposite the body. There, cast by the low morning sun streaming through the window, was a shadow. Long, distorted, humanoid. It stretched across the wallpaper as though a tall figure had stood between the corpse and the light. Yet the room was empty, save for the living and the dead. Colonel Blaine muttered an oath. Lady Harrington turned away, pale but composed. Poirot stood slowly. "The shadow," he said quietly. "It has returned." Evelyn Trevorrow appeared in the doorway, eyes fixed on the dark silhouette on the wall. "Just like 1897, she whispered. Dr. Lang joined the group, his face impassive. "A remarkable repetition," he observed. Richard found his voice. "But it's impossible. No one could have got in or out. We're snowed in, have been since yesterday." Poirot smoothed his moustache, eyes very green. "Impossible, perhaps. Yet Monsieur Pemberton is most certainly dead. Stabbed with a narrow blade. Perhaps the very paper knife I observed in the library last night, and again this morning." A ripple of unease passed through the group. Lord Harrington found his voice. We must inform the police." "Alas," Poirot said gently, "the telephone is dead, the road's impassable. We are isolated. Therefore, mesdames et messieurs, it falls to Hercule Poirot to investigate this tragic event." He looked slowly around the circle of shocked faces. "And I assure you," he added softly, "the truth will be discovered. For as the note warned us last night, the shadow has returned, and this time it has killed." Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and relentless, erasing any hope of rescue from the world beyond Blackwood Manor. Chapter 5. Shadows of the Past. The discovery of Silas Pemberton's body cast a pall over Blackwood Manor that no amount of Yule cheer could dispel. By early afternoon on Christmas Day, the guests had withdrawn into small, uneasy knots, some by the drawing-room fire, others pacing the corridors, all avoiding the west wing where the bedroom door now stood locked and guarded by a grim-faced footman at Lord Harrington's order. Hercule Poirot, however, was busy. He began in the library, that sombre room which seemed to lie at the heart of both past and present tragedies. With Lord Harrington's reluctant permission, he had the ivory-handled paper knife wrapped in a silk handkerchief and set aside. It was, as he had suspected, the murder weapon. The narrow blade fitted the wound exactly, and faint traces of blood had dried along one edge, invisible to the casual glance. Yet the knife had been wiped almost clean, careful, but not careful enough for the little grey cells of Hercule Poirot. He spent an hour alone in the library, measuring angles of light, examining the panelling, tapping walls for hidden hollows. At length he summoned Briggs, the chauffeur, and requested a tall library ladder. From the topmost step he studied the high windows, the cornices, the ancient beams. Nothing. No secret entrance, no concealed passage thus far. But Poirot was patient. At 3:00, he requested that the guests assemble in the drawing-room. They came reluctantly, faces pale, eyes avoiding one another. Even Colonel Blaine's bluster had deserted him. He sat twisting his moustache and staring into the fire. Poirot stood before the hearth, small and immaculate, hands clasped behind his back. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began quietly, "it is necessary that we speak of the past if we are to understand the present. This house has seen murder before. On Christmas Day, 1897. Monsieur Pemberton has now been killed in almost identical circumstances, stabbed in a locked house, surrounded by snow, with a strange shadow cast upon the wall. Coincidence? No, it is imitation, or continuation. Lady Harrington lifted her chin. You suggest that someone here is copying an old crime. I suggest more, madame. I suggest that the crime of today is rooted in the crime of yesterday. Therefore, we must unearth the earlier tragedy. He turned to Evelyn Trevorrow. Mademoiselle, you are related to the former owners. You have spoken of your great-grandmother. Tell us, please, what truly happened in 1897. Evelyn hesitated, then nodded. She stood, composed but pale. My great-grandmother, Charlotte Blackwood, was 19 that Christmas. The family was gathered much as we are now, 12 guests. The victim was her elder brother, Reginald, aged 25, heir to the estate. On Christmas morning, he was found in this very library, stabbed once in the back. The doors were locked from within, the windows bolted, deep snow unbroken beneath them. On the wall behind the body was a shadow, tall, distorted, as though cast by a figure standing between Reginald and the gas lamp. Yet the room was empty. She paused, glancing around the circle. The inquest returned an open verdict. Whispers of suicide were silenced by the family. They insisted it was murder. But no weapon was ever found, and no motive established. Reginald was well liked, solvent, engaged to be married. After the funeral, the family left Blackwood Manor and never returned. It stood empty until Lord Harrington purchased it 5 years ago. Dr. Lang spoke softly from his corner. There was, however, one curious detail often omitted from popular accounts. Reginald Blackwood had begun investigating certain irregularities in the family munitions business during the Boer War, profits that could not be fully explained. He had confided to his fiancée that he intended to confront someone on Christmas Eve. All eyes turned involuntarily to Lord Harrington. His own business empire had begun with wartime contracts. He met the stairs steadily. I bought the house in good faith, he said gruffly. I knew the old story naturally. But ancient scandals are not my concern. Yet they have become so, Poirot observed. For Silas Pemberton was your business partner, was he not? And lately there have been difficulties. Harrington's jaw tightened. Silas Pemberton's death had removed a man who knew too much, perhaps. Richard Harrington laughed harshly. Difficulties? That's putting it mildly. Pemberton was threatening to go to the authorities. Claimed father had cooked the books on some post-war contracts. Wanted a larger share to keep quiet. Richard, Lady Harrington snapped. It's true, mother. Everyone knows it. Pemberton was bleeding us dry. Colonel Blaine cleared his throat. Steady on, lad. The man's dead. Richard subsided, but the damage was done. Motive had been laid bare. Poirot raised a hand. We will return to motives presently. First, another discovery. He drew from his pocket a small leather-bound diary, its cover cracked with age. This was concealed behind a loose panel in the library chimney. It belonged to Charlotte Blackwood. She wrote daily during that fatal Christmas. He opened it to a marked page and read aloud in his precise voice. December 24th, 1897. Reginald is agitated. He says the shadow is not superstition but fact. Someone in the house profits from blood money and will stop at nothing. He has proof hidden in the library. Tonight he will confront the guilty one. I begged him to wait, but he laughed and said justice must be served, even at Christmas. Poirot closed the book. The next entry is dated December 26th. Charlotte writes only, My brother is dead. The shadow has taken him. God forgive us all. A long silence followed. Outside, Snow tapped softly against the windows. Mrs. Forsyth, the widow in black lace, spoke for the first time. "And you believe the same thing is happening again? That someone is killing to protect an old secret?" "Or a new one built upon the old," Poirot replied. "Consider, Silas Pemberton was stabbed with the paper knife from the library below. The killer must have carried it upstairs, committed the deed, and returned it, yet no one saw them. The shadow on the wall was cast by morning sunlight through the window. To produce such a tall, distorted silhouette, something or someone must have stood between the body and the light for several moments. Yet when Mrs. Blaine entered, the room was empty." He paused, letting the impossibility sink in. "Therefore," he continued, "either we have a ghost, or a very clever assassin who understands light, shadows, and human perception." Clarissa Wade gave a small, frightened sound. Evelyn put a protective arm around her. Lord Harrington rose heavily. "This is all very interesting, Monsieur Poirot, but it doesn't bring Pemberton back. What do you propose to do?" "I propose," Poirot said calmly, "to search every room in this house. With your permission, of course." Harrington hesitated, then nodded. "Very well. Briggs and the footman will assist." The search began at once. Poirot directed it with military precision, examining wardrobes, tapping floors, lifting carpets. In Richard Harrington's room, they found a half-empty bottle of veronal, sleeping powder, and a loaded service revolver in a drawer. Richard flushed but said nothing. In Dr. Lang's austere chamber, they discovered a small portable darkroom kit and several photographic plates, some developed, showing various angles of the library. "Merely scientific interest," Lang murmured when questioned. In Mrs. Forsyth's room, hidden beneath lingerie in a drawer, Poirot found a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. Love letters from a much younger Lord Harrington, written before his marriage. Lady Harrington, passing in the corridor, saw them and turned white, but said nothing. In the attic, they uncovered boxes of old Blackwood papers, ledgers from the 1890s showing unexplained payments to a Swiss account. The initials beside the entries were E.H., Edmund Harrington's own. Harrington stared at them, face unreadable. "My father's markings," he said at last. "He invested in the old firm. Nothing illegal. Perhaps," Poirot conceded, "but suggestive." Dusk fell early, the short winter day surrendering to night. The search concluded with nothing more incriminating than the items already found. The guests gathered for a sombre tea in the dining room, sandwiches untouched, conversation desultory. At 6 o'clock, the lights failed. It was sudden and complete. Every lamp, every candle extinguished as though by a giant hand. The house plunged into darkness broken only by the red glow of dying fires. A woman screamed, "Mrs. Blaine!" Then chaos, chairs scraping, voices calling. Poirot remained seated, counting under his breath. At 15 seconds, a match flared. Dr. Lang lighting a candle. By its wavering flame, faces appeared. Frightened, suspicious. "The generator," Lord Harrington muttered. "Briggs will see to it." But Briggs returned 10 minutes later with disturbing news. The generator was undamaged. Fuel ample, yet someone had deliberately thrown the master switch in the cellar. "And there are wet footprints on the stone floor," he added, "leading from the cellar door to the back stairs. Melting snow." The candle flames danced wildly as a draught swept through the room. Poirot rose. "Come, we will examine this at once." They trooped down to the cellar in a flickering procession. Lord Harrington carrying a storm lantern, Poirot close behind. The footprints were plain. Large boots, melting rapidly, leading up the servants' stairs toward the main house. At the top of the stairs, the prince vanished on the carpeted corridor. But something else caught Poirot's sharp eye. On the wall beside the staircase, in the lantern's swaying light, a shadow moved, long, tall, humanoid. It stretched across the plaster, wavered, and was gone. Clarissa Wade whimpered. Richard swore under his breath. Poirot stood motionless, gazing at the blank wall. "Mon Dieu!" he whispered. "The shadow walks again." Above them, somewhere in the darkened house, a door closed softly, and in the sudden hush, Poirot heard, or imagined he heard, the faintest echo of footsteps retreating into the upper floors. The game, he reflected grimly, had entered a new and more dangerous phase. Chapter 6. The Yuletide Deception. Christmas Day slipped into evening with the heaviness of a house in mourning. The body of Silas Pemberton remained in his locked bedroom, wrapped respectfully in a sheet by the footmen under Poirot's direction. No doctor could be summoned, no undertaker reached. The snow had sealed them all in as effectively as a crypt. Dinner was a subdued affair, cold meats, soup, and silence. Even Colonel Blaine's customary anecdotes failed him. Afterwards, the party drifted to the drawing-room, drawn together by the animal need for company in the face of danger. The fires were built high, lamps and candles multiplied until the room blazed with light, as though brightness alone could banish shadows. Hercule Poirot sat in a high-winged armchair close to the hearth, hands folded over his neat stomach, eyes half closed. He had said little since the discovery of the wet footprints in the cellar. The others watched him covertly, waiting for the great detective to speak, to act, to reassure them that order would be restored. At 9 o'clock, Poirot rose with sudden decision. "Mesdames et messieurs," he announced, "it is time we confront the shadow directly. I propose a small experiment. We will recreate the conditions under which Monsieur Pemberton was killed." A murmur of unease rippled through the room. Lord Harrington frowned. "Recreate? How exactly?" "Quite simply. We will return to the library, the scene of the original crime, and observe how light and shadow behave. I have observed certain possibilities, but I require witnesses." Richard gave a nervous laugh. "You want us to play at ghosts, Poirot?" "I want us," Poirot replied evenly, "to play at truth." Dr. Lang inclined his head with interest. Evelyn Trevorrow's violet eyes were steady. Clarissa Wade looked terrified, but nodded when Evelyn took her hand. One by one, the others agreed. There seemed no safer course than to remain under Poirot's watchful eye. They processed down the corridor like a funeral party. Lord and Lady Harrington, Richard, the Blaines, Mrs. Culp Forsyth, and her smooth companion, Mr. Drake, Dr. Lang, Evelyn, Clarissa, and finally Poirot, bringing up the rear with a storm lantern. The library door stood open. Inside, the fire had been freshly laid and lit. Candles burned on mantel and tables. The great partner's desk had been cleared, save for a single desk lamp positioned exactly where Poirot had directed earlier. Poirot arranged them in a semicircle facing the wall behind the desk. "Observe," he said, "the lamp is placed as it was in 1897, and as sunlight fell this morning in Monsieur Pemberton's room. Now, I will stand here." He took position between the lamp and the wall. His shadow fell across the panelling, compact, precise, unmistakably Poirot. "Ordinary," he commented. "Now, Briggs, if you please." The chauffeur, who had been waiting in the corridor, entered carrying a long pole to which a black cloak had been fastened. At Poirot's signal, he held it high above his head behind the lamp. The shadow on the wall changed dramatically. Tall, distorted, hooded, a menacing silhouette fully 8 feet high. Gasps escaped several throats. Clarissa clutched Evelyn's arm. "You see," Poirot said quietly, "a simple illusion. Height, angle, and a little preparation. The phantom shadow is no ghost, but a trick of light." Colonel Blaine cleared his throat. Clever, by Jove! But in Pemberton's room it was morning sunlight, no lamp. "Precisely," Poirot replied, "which suggests an accomplice, or a mechanism. A mirror, perhaps, or a silhouette cut from card, held aloft at the critical moment, and then swiftly removed." He turned to the assembly. "But there is more. Tonight, under the Christmas tree, certain delicacies were served. Turkish delight, sugared almonds, marrons glacés, all most festive. Yet one plate of marrons glacés was laced with a heavy dose of veronal, the sleeping powder I observed in Monsieur Richard's room." Richard started. "Now see here." Poirot raised a placating hand. "The powder was not in your bottle diminished, monsieur. Someone took a quantity earlier. Enough, had it been consumed, to render a man unconscious for hours." Mrs. Blaine gave a small cry. "But who?" "The intended victim," Poirot continued calmly, "was to have been Lord Harrington." All eyes turned to the host. He stood very still, face impassive. "Consider," Poirot went on, "the poisoned sweets were on a small silver tray placed conveniently near his lordship's chair during tea. Only the untimely failure of the lights and the discovery of the cellar footprints caused distraction. The tray was removed untouched." Lady Harrington's hand flew to her throat. "Edmund, someone tried to drug you?" "Indeed, madam. And had it succeeded, the stage would have been set for a second murder, perhaps blamed on the shadow once more." Richard's face was flushed. "This is monstrous! Who would dare?" Poirot's gaze swept the room. "Someone with much to lose. Someone who knew of the old crime and sought to use it as camouflage. Someone who understood mirrors, lights, and hidden mechanisms." Dr. Lang's dark eyes gleamed. "Fascinating, Monsieur Poirot. You believe the killer has constructed an elaborate apparatus?" "I believe," Poirot said, "that the house itself is part of the deception. Blackwood Manor is old. It has priest holes, concealed passages, perhaps even a secret room. During the search today we found nothing, but we did not look everywhere." He moved to the bookshelves lining the east wall and began pressing the carved oak mouldings with practiced fingers. The others watched in tense silence. At the third shelf, a soft click sounded. A section of shelving swung inward, revealing a narrow passage barely wide enough for a man. Exclamations broke out. Lord Harrington strode forward, lantern raised. "Good God! The old priest hole!" The passage was stone-lined, dusty, smelling of earth and age. It ran parallel to the library wall for 10 feet before turning sharply. Poirot entered first, lantern high. The others crowded behind. At the turn they found a small chamber, barely 6 feet square. On a crude table lay the apparatus Poirot had suspected. A tall cardboard silhouette painted black, jointed at the shoulders, fine wires leading upward through a hole in the ceiling, a system of pulleys and counterweights. Beside it, a hand mirror on a swivel stand and a battery-powered torch. With this, Poirot explained, the killer could, from this hidden vantage, project the shadow into the library at will. The wires raised the figure, the torch behind it cast the silhouette on the wall. A simple but effective stage trick. Evelyn's voice was hushed. So the shadow was never supernatural. Never, Poirot confirmed, merely murderous theatre. But his expression remained grave. Yet this explains only the illusion, not the murders themselves. The passage leads upward. Observe the iron rungs in the wall. It connects to the upper floors. The killer could move unseen through the house. Lord Harrington's face was grim. Then no one is safe. Precisely, Poirot said. Therefore, I have taken precautions. He reached into his pocket and produced a small silver whistle. Briggs and the footman are stationed at key points. At the first sign of danger, we summon them. He turned back to the group. But there is one more thing. Among the Christmas decorations on the tree, I observed a most curious ornament, a glass bauble painted with the Harrington coat of arms. Inside it, concealed, was this. He held up a tiny roll of paper. Unrolling it beneath the lantern, he read, "The second act begins at midnight. The guilty will fall as Pemberton fell." The message was typed, like the first anonymous note. Mrs. Forsyth gave a theatrical shudder. Mr. Drake's smooth face remained expressionless. Richard exploded. "This is intolerable! We're being toyed with like mice!" Poirot regarded him thoughtfully. "Patience, monsieur. The killer grows reckless. Recklessness leads to mistakes." He led them back to the library and closed the secret panel. "Now, I suggest we return to the drawing room. Midnight approaches. We will wait together, and we will watch." As they filed out, Poirot lingered a moment, shining his lantern once more into the hidden chamber. Something on the dusty floor caught his eye. A single fresh fingerprint in the grime on the table edge. He memorized its position, then followed the others. In the drawing room, the clock on the mantel showed 11:45. The fire had burned low, candles guttered in their sockets. The party sat in a rough circle, eyes darting to every flicker of flame. At 11:55, the lights failed again. This time no one screamed. Darkness was absolute. Poirot's voice cut through it, calm and commanding. "Remain seated! No one move!" A match scraped, Dr. Lang lighting a candle. By its frail glow, faces appeared, tense, frightened. The candle flame wavered violently, as though in a sudden draught. From the corridor came the soft but unmistakable sound of a door opening. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, approached the drawing room. Every head turned toward the open doorway. In the gap appeared a shadow, tall, impossibly tall, stretching across the floor toward them. It moved as though alive, advancing inch by inch. Clarissa Wade whimpered. Colonel Blaine half rose, fists clenched. The shadow reached the threshold and stopped. Poirot's whistle shrilled, piercing the silence. Heavy footsteps pounded in the corridor. Briggs and the footman running. Lanterns flared. Light flooded the doorway. There was no one there, only the shadow, cast by a jointed cardboard figure suspended on wires from the chandelier directly above the door, swaying gently in the draught from the secret passage. The wires led back into darkness, vanishing through a small hole drilled in the ceiling rose. Poirot stepped forward and seized the figure. It was identical to the one in the hidden chamber. "The killer's second attempt," he said quietly. "A diversion, to draw us away perhaps, or to heighten terror." He looked around the circle of pale faces. "But the little grey cells tell me we are close now. Very close. The net tightens." Outside, the wind rose again, rattling the windows like impatient fingers. Midnight struck. Solemn, mournful strokes from the grandfather clock in the hall. Christmas Day was ended. And in the renewed silence, Poirot heard it clearly. Somewhere deep in the house, a muffled thud, as though something or someone had fallen heavily. The third act, he reflected grimly, had begun. Chapter 7, The Phantom Pursuit. The muffled thud echoed through Blackwood Manor like a gunshot in a tomb. For a heartbeat, the drawing room remained frozen, candle flames trembling, faces bleached by shock. Then chaos erupted. "Stay together," Poirot commanded sharply, but his voice was almost lost as chairs scraped and voices rose in panic. Lord Harrington seized a lantern and strode toward the door. Richard was already in the corridor, shouting for Briggs. Colonel Blaine blustered after him, Mrs. Blaine clinging to his arm. The others followed in a rush, Poirot bringing up the rear with Dr. Lang at his side. The sound had come from the upper floor, the east wing, where the guest bedrooms lay. They pounded up the grand staircase, lanterns swinging wild shadows across walls and ceilings. At the landing, Richard halted abruptly. "It came from Evelyn's room," he cried. The door to Evelyn Trevorrow's bedroom stood ajar. A faint groan issued from within. Poirot pushed past and entered first. Evelyn lay sprawled on the carpet beside her overturned bedside table, a darkening bruise on her temple. Her violet eyes fluttered open as the light fell upon her. "Evelyn!" Clarissa Wade dropped to her knees beside her friend, tears starting. Poirot knelt swiftly, fingers at Evelyn's throat. The pulse was strong, the injury, though painful, not fatal. "She lives," he announced. "A blow to the head, delivered from behind, I think. Mademoiselle, can you speak?" Evelyn's voice was faint. "Someone in the room when the lights went out again. I felt a presence, turned, then nothing." Poirot's gaze swept the chamber. The window was closed, curtains drawn. A single candle had been relit by Clarissa, throwing long shadows. On the dressing table lay Evelyn's leather writing case, open, papers scattered. "Someone searched her belongings," Poirot murmured, and was interrupted by her return. Lord Harrington's face was thunderous. "This has gone far enough. We'll search the house top to bottom, now." Poirot raised a hand. "Patience, my lord. The killer is bold, yes, but also desperate. Desperation breeds error. We will pursue, but with method." He examined the floor. Beside the bed, half concealed by the counterpane, lay a small brass key. Old, ornate, clearly not modern. "This is not yours, mademoiselle." Evelyn, now propped against pillows with Clarissa's help, shook her head weakly. "No, I've never seen it." Poirot pocketed it thoughtfully. "Then it was dropped by our phantom in haste. A clue most valuable." He turned to the window and drew back the curtain. Snow had ceased. Moonlight silvered the drifts below. 3 stories down, the ground lay undisturbed except for one thing. A single line of footprints leading from directly beneath the window toward the old stable block. "Mon Dieu!" Colonel Blaine exclaimed. "Someone went out, and in this snow they'll leave a clear trail." Richard was already at the door. "I'll get my rifle." "No!" Poirot's voice cracked like a whip. "We go together." "Armed, yes, but together. The killer wishes to separate us. We will not oblige." Boots, coats, and lanterns were seized in frantic haste. Briggs and 2 footmen were summoned, armed with shotguns from the gunroom. Within 5 minutes the entire party, save Evelyn and Clarissa, who remained behind with the door locked, descended to the ground floor and emerged into the freezing night through a side entrance. The air was knife-sharp, the snow knee-deep in places. Moonlight turned the landscape to a glittering waste. The footprints were plain. A man's boots, deep and purposeful, leading across the lawn, past the frozen fountain, toward the darkened stables. Lord Harrington led, lantern high. Richard flanked him, revolver in hand. Poirot walked just behind, eyes scanning every drift and shadow. Dr. Lang followed silently. Mrs. Forsyth clung to Mr. Drake's arm, her black lace trailing like a mourner's veil. the stables loomed ahead, a long stone building with a clock tower. The footprints entered through a side door left ajar. Inside, the air smelled of hay, leather, and cold iron. Moonlight filtered through high windows, striping the stalls. Most were empty, but faint steam rose from one near the far end. A horse disturbed. The footprints continued along the central aisle, then turned sharply into a harness room. Poirot signalled silence. They advanced cautiously. The harness room door stood open. Inside, a lantern burned low on a bench, casting grotesque shadows among hanging bridles and saddles. And in the centre of the floor lay a dark figure, motionless. Richard lunged forward. "Got you!" But Poirot caught his arm. "Attendes!" It was not a body. It was a dummy. Another jointed cardboard silhouette, like the ones before, dressed in a black cloak and hooded mask. The head had fallen forward when the supporting wire was cut. A trap. From above came a sudden clatter. Someone moving in the hayloft. Briggs swung his shotgun upward. "Come down, you devil!" A shadow flickered across the moonlit opening. Then a rope ladder was kicked away, and footsteps pounded across the loft toward the far end. "He's making for the clock tower!" Colonel Blaine roared. They rushed back into the aisle. A narrow staircase led upward at the end of the building. Lord Harrington took the steps 2 at a time, the others close behind. Poirot, though less agile, kept pace with grim determination. The loft was vast, hay-scented, moonbeams slanting through slits in the tile roof. At the far end, a door stood open onto the clock tower stairs. They burst into the tower. Spiral iron steps rang beneath booted feet as they climbed. The mechanism of the old clock ticked solemnly above them. Higher and higher, past the great brass gears, past the frozen hands forever fixed at midnight, until they emerged onto the narrow exterior gallery that ringed the tower just below the roof. The fugitive was there, a tall figure in black, hooded, face concealed. Moonlight glinted on something in his hand, the ivory-handled paper knife. He stood at the edge of the gallery, back to the parapet, 30 feet above the snow-covered courtyard. "Stop!" Lord Harrington shouted. "There's no way down!" The figure's head turned. For a moment, the hooded mask stared at them like some medieval executioner. Then, with chilling deliberation, he raised the paper knife and hurled it, not at them, but outward into the night. It flashed once in the moonlight and vanished into the drifts below. Richard raised his revolver. "Don't move!" But the figure was already moving, vaulting onto the narrow parapet, arms outstretched for balance. Poirot stepped forward, voice calm. "It is finished. You cannot escape. Come down peacefully." The hooded head turned toward him. For a long moment, the two men regarded each other across the freezing void. Then the figure laughed. A low, familiar laugh that sent ice through Poirot's veins. With a sudden leap, he dived outward into the night. Gasps echoed around the gallery, but there was no sickening impact. Instead, a soft thud and silence. They rushed to the parapet. Below, in the deep snow directly beneath the tower, lay a dark indentation where the figure had landed. From it, fresh footprints led swiftly away across the virgin snow toward the woods that bordered the estate. "Impossible!" Colonel Blaine exploded. "That's a 30-foot drop. He should have broken his neck." Poirot leaned out, eyes narrowed. Observe the snowdrift against the wall, piled high by the storm. A soft landing, calculated in advance. Our killer is resourceful. Lanterns were swung over the edge. The footprints were clear, heading into the dense fir plantation that cloaked the northern boundary. Lord Harrington's face was stone. "We'll follow. Briggs, fetch the dogs." But Poirot laid a restraining hand on his arm. "No, milord. The woods are thick, the snow deeper still. By the time hounds are roused, the trail will be cold. And consider, he wishes us to pursue into darkness. Separated, exhausted. No. We return to the house. We have gained much this night." Richard rounded on him angrily. "Gained? The devil nearly killed Evelyn and escaped scot-free." "Escaped?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "I think not. Observe." He pointed downward. In the snow beside the landing place, something glinted. The paper knife, half buried, its blade catching moonlight. And the key dropped in Mademoiselle Trevorrow's room. Its wards are most distinctive. "It belongs, I believe, to the old Blackwood muniments room in the West Tower, a room long locked. Tomorrow, when light returns, we will open it. And we will find, I am convinced, the heart of this affair." He turned back toward the stairs. "Also, our phantom left something behind in his haste." From his pocket he drew a small scrap of black cloth, torn from the cloak during the struggle with the rope ladder. Wool, very fine, from a garment not common. And note the scent, faint but unmistakable. Russian leather and bergamot, a most individual cologne. Dr. Lang's dark eyes flickered with interest. "You know whose it is?" "I begin to suspect," Poirot replied softly. "The pieces assemble themselves. The motive, the method, the shadow, all connect." As they descended the iron stairs, the great clock above them began unexpectedly to chime. 12 slow, mournful strokes reverberating through the frozen night. Midnight again. Richard shivered. "That clock hasn't worked in years." "Precisely," Poirot murmured. "Someone has been busy in the tower before us." "Preparing the stage." They emerged into the stable yard. The footprints leading to the woods were already softening at the edges, as a fresh flurry of snow began. By morning, Poirot reflected, they would be gone entirely. But the little grey cells required no footprints. The hunter had become the hunted. And Hercule Poirot was closing in. Back in the warmth of the manor, doors locked and barred, the exhausted party gathered once more in the drawing-room. Evelyn, pale but composed, had been moved to a chair by the fire, a cold compress on her temple. Poirot stood before them, small and implacable. "Tomorrow," he declared, "on the feast of St. Stephen, the truth will be revealed. I ask only that you remain within the house. No one leaves, no one wanders alone. The killer is cornered. One final deception remains, perhaps. But it will not succeed." He looked slowly around the circle of strained faces. "For the shadow has been explained. The phantom has been pursued. And the heart," he tapped his forehead, "the heart knows its quarry." Outside, the wind rose once more, driving snow against the windows like frantic fingers seeking entry. Inside, the fires burned low, and no one slept. The night was far from over. Chapter 8. The Final Revelation. The morning of December 26th dawned cold and brilliant. Sunlight poured through the high windows of Blackwood Manor, turning the snow-covered grounds to a dazzling expanse. Inside, the house felt drained, as though the events of the past 2 days had drawn the very breath from its ancient stones. The guests assembled in the great hall at 11 o'clock, summoned by a note from Hercule Poirot, delivered with their breakfast trays. They came reluctantly, heavy-eyed and silent. Lord and Lady Harrington side by side on a settle, Richard pacing restlessly, Colonel and Mrs. Blaine seated close together, Mrs. Forsyth and Mr. Drake in stiff attitudes, Clarissa Wade pale beside Evelyn Trevorrow, whose temple still bore a dark bruise. Dr. Felix Lang stood apart by the Christmas tree, hands clasped behind his back, expression unreadable. The tree itself looked forlorn now. Candles extinguished, tinsel dulled, a few fallen needles scattered on the velvet skirt. Poirot entered last, immaculate as ever in a charcoal suit, waistcoat buttoned precisely, spats gleaming. He carried a small leather folder under one arm. Briggs and 2 footmen stood behind him, faces impassive. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice ringing clear in the hushed hall. "The time has come for truth. The shadow that has haunted this house, first in 1897, now in our own time, will be banished forever." He placed the folder on a small table and opened it with deliberate care. "First, let us dispense with the supernatural. The killer's shadow was, as I demonstrated last night, a simple illusion. Cardboard, wires, mirrors, torchlight. Clever, theatrical, but entirely human. The same device was used to terrify us in the drawing room and to cast the silhouette in Monsieur Pemberton's death chamber." Colonel Blaine grunted approval. "Stage trickery. Knew it all along." Poirot inclined his head. "Quite. But the murders themselves, those required more than trickery. They required motive, opportunity, and a cold determination." He turned to Lord Harrington. "Milord, with your permission, we visited the old muniments room in the West Tower this morning, using the key dropped in Mademoiselle Trevorrow's chamber." Harrington nodded stiffly. "We found there," Poirot continued, "certain documents long hidden, ledgers from the Blackwood munitions firm of the 1890s, and a sealed confession written by Reginald Blackwood shortly before his death." Evelyn drew a sharp breath. Reginald, Poirot said gently, had discovered that profits from the family business during the Boer War were inflated by fraudulent contracts. Large sums had been diverted to a private account in Switzerland. The initials beside the entries were not those of a Blackwood, but of a trusted adviser to the firm, Dr. Felix Lang, the grandfather of our present Dr. Lang. All eyes turned to the thin, dark man by the tree. He remained motionless, only the faintest smile touching his lips. "The elder Dr. Lang," Poirot went on, "was never prosecuted. Reginald intended to expose him on Christmas Eve, 1897. To prevent this, Lang killed him, staging the murder as an impossible crime, using the shadow illusion he had perfected as an amateur conjurer. The family, fearing scandal, hushed the matter and fled the house." Dr. Lang spoke for the first time, voice soft and precise. "A fascinating reconstruction, Monsieur Poirot, but ancient history. What possible bearing?" "Patience, Doctor. We come to the present." Poirot lifted a document from the folder. When Lord Harrington purchased Blackwood Manor 5 years ago, he commissioned repairs. In the West Tower, the builders uncovered the hidden muniments room, still sealed since 1897. His lordship, curious, examined the papers. He recognized the name Lang from his own wartime business dealings. Your grandfather had been an investor in the Harrington firm also. Lord Harrington's face was ashen. I confronted Felix privately when he visited last year. He admitted the old fraud, but claimed it irrelevant. I agreed to keep silent, for old friendship's sake." Lady Harrington stared at her husband in horror. "But Silas Pemberton," Poirot continued, "discovered the same documents during a visit 6 months ago. He threatened exposure unless Lord Harrington paid him a fortune in shares. Blackmail. His lordship resisted. Pemberton grew insistent." Richard burst out, "Father, you never told me." Harrington did not answer. Poirot turned again to Dr. Lang. "And you, Doctor, you have been obsessed with the 1897 case all your life. You studied the police photographs, wrote monographs on impossible crimes when you learned, through Lord Harrington's confidence, that the old scandal was in danger of resurfacing, and that Pemberton threatened not only his lordship, but the Lang family name. You acted. Lang's smile widened fractionally. You accuse me of murder, monsieur. I state facts. You arrived early for this house party, 2 days before the storm closed the roads. Ample time to prepare your apparatus in the priest hole and stables. You sent the anonymous notes, typed on the old Remington in the estate office, to create terror and confusion. You poisoned the Maren's glacés intended for Lord Harrington, hoping to silence him before he could yield to Pemberton's demands. Mrs. Blaine gasped. You killed Pemberton with the paper knife from the library, carrying it upstairs via the secret passage, stabbing him as he stood at his window admiring the snow. You then activated the shadow device from the hidden chamber before fleeing back through the passage. The wet footprints in the cellar were your own, deliberately made to suggest an outside intruder. Lang inclined his head mockingly. All very ingenious, but proof? Poirot held up the scrap of black cloth. This, torn from your cloak last night in the stables. The wool matches the academic gown you wear at university lectures, black finest merino, and the scent of Russian leather and bergamot is distinctive. I took the liberty of examining your dressing case this morning. The cologne bottle matches exactly. He produced the ivory-handled paper knife, now wrapped in silk. Your fingerprints are upon the handle, clearly visible under magnification after I dusted it with powder from the darkroom kit in your room. You forgot to wipe it completely in your haste to discard it from the tower. Lang's composure cracked for the first time. His eyes darted toward the door. But the final proof, Poirot said softly, is motive beyond greed or fear. You wish to vindicate your grandfather. By recreating his crime perfectly and solving it yourself, you intended to prove that the 1897 murder was indeed impossible, committed by no human hand, a ghost, thus your family name cleansed forever. He paused, letting the silence deepen. You attacked Mademoiselle Trevorrow because she, as a descendant of the Blackwoods, had begun researching the old case anew. She was close to the truth. You searched her room for her notes, dropping the muniment's room key in your flight when the lights returned. Evelyn stared at Lang with dawning comprehension and disgust. Dr. Lang straightened, the faint smile returning. Brilliant, Monsieur Poirot. Truly brilliant. But you forget one thing. We are still snowbound. No police can reach us for days, and a man may still choose his own exit. He moved with sudden swiftness, snatching a silver candlestick from a side table and hurling it toward the great chandelier overhead. The impact shattered crystal. Candles scattered, flames leaping to the dry evergreens draped along the beams. Fire caught with terrifying speed. Chaos erupted, shouts, scrambling feet. But Poirot was prepared. He blew 3 sharp blasts on his silver whistle. Briggs and the footman sprang forward, seizing Lang's arms and pinning him helplessly as he struggled. At the same moment, other servants appeared with buckets and soda siphon extinguishers. The flames were beaten down before they could spread. Lang sagged in the footman's grip, defiance gone, face suddenly old and defeated. Lord Harrington found his voice. "Felix, why?" Lang looked at him with bitter contempt. "Because you were weak, Edmund. You were going to pay Pemberton. Let the old shame be dragged into daylight again. I could not allow it." Poirot smoothed his moustache with quiet satisfaction. "And now it is daylight indeed. The shadow is dispelled." Outside, the sun climbed higher, melting icicles from the eaves in long, glittering drops. The snow had begun to thaw. By late afternoon, Briggs reported that the telephone lines were restored. A fallen branch had been cleared by estate workers. Scotland Yard was summoned. Dr. Lang was confined under guard until officers could reach the manor the following day. The guests gathered one final time in the drawing room for tea. Subdued, but with the terrible tension lifted, Evelyn sat beside Clarissa, a notebook open on her lap in which she had begun to record the true history of 1897, no longer hidden. Richard poured sherry with a steadier hand. Lady Harrington spoke quietly with her husband in a corner, reconciliation beginning. Poirot stood by the window, watching meltwater drip from the raven-topped gateposts far down the drive. Evelyn approached him, eyes clear. "Monsieur Poirot, you have given my family justice at last. Thank you." He bowed. "It is the truth that gives justice, mademoiselle. I merely arranged it neatly." She smiled faintly. "Will you stay for the new year?" "Alas, no. London calls, but I will carry with me the memory of a most interesting Christmas." As the sun set crimson behind the moors, Poirot's car was brought round. He took his leave with handshakes and quiet thanks. Lord Harrington pressed the silver cigarette case upon him again. "Keep it, monsieur. You have earned it 1,000 times." In the car, descending the winding drive between walls of thawing snow, Poirot leaned back against the leather cushions and permitted himself a small sigh of contentment. The little grey cells had triumphed once more. Behind him, Blackwood Manor stood dark against the winter sky, its windows glowing warmly. No longer haunted by shadows, but merely an old house with a new chapter beginning. And somewhere in the distance, church bells rang out across the moors for the feast of St. Stephen. Hercule Poirot closed his eyes and smiled. It had been, after all, a very merry Christmas.